The morning air in this particular slice of the Pyrenees had a champagne crispness to it, even in late spring. We'd found a small, unofficial pull-off high above a valley that was still cupping shreds of mist like a precious secret. Mark was already on his second cup of coffee, leaning against the Wanderer, our trusty, sometimes temperamental, four-wheeled home. I, Sarah, was still nursing my first, watching the sun begin to paint the opposing peaks in strokes of apricot and rose. It's moments like these, the quiet ones, that often make us reflect. You know, Mark began, his voice a low rumble that didn't disturb the morning's peace. People always ask us. They see the van, they hear we've been on the road for 5 years now, full-time, and their eyes get wide. I nodded, smiling. They ask if we drive each other crazy in such a small space. 24/7, they say, usually with a kind of horrified awe. Mark chuckled. And we always tell them the truth, don't we? That this life, this tiny home on wheels, it hasn't just been an adventure across continents, it's been the most profound journey for our relationship. Honestly, it's probably the best thing that ever happened to us, to our 30 years together. It's a bold statement, we know. Before the Wanderer, life was comfortable. Predictable. We had the house in the suburbs, the careers that had once been exciting but had settled into a well-worn groove. We weren't unhappy, not exactly. But there was a sense, a quiet, creeping sense, that we were living parallel lives. We'd pass each other in the hallway, share a quick dinner, discuss household logistics, and then retreat to our respective corners, our respective screens. The connection, that spark that had brought us together all those years ago, felt like it was buried under layers of routine and unspoken assumptions. The decision to sell the house, to pack our lives into 70 square feet of rolling metal and hope, was monumental. It wasn't a snap decision, it was months, nearly a year, of hushed late-night conversations, of spreadsheets and anxieties, of what-ifs that loomed larger than any mountain range. And if I'm honest, my deepest fear wasn't about the mechanics of van life, where we'd park, how we'd find water, or even personal safety. My deepest fear, the one I barely dared to whisper to Mark, was about us. What if stripping away all the buffers, all the distractions, all the separate rooms, revealed that we'd grown too far apart? What if, in that tiny, inescapable space, we found we didn't like each other's company quite as much as we thought? Mark had his own worries. He confessed later that he worried he'd be too set in his ways, too impatient. He worried that the stress of the unknown would bring out his worst, and that I'd finally get tired of it. Our old life, he'd said one evening, staring out at the identical houses on our street, it allowed us to not notice things. To not work on things. This won't. He was right. The Wanderer, our beautiful, resilient, occasionally infuriatingly stubborn Ford Transit, became our crucible. Learning its moods, its creaks and groans, how much diesel it really needed versus what the gauge claimed, how to coax the heater into life on a frosty morning, it was an exercise in patience and teamwork from day one. And in many ways, learning the van was like learning each other all over again, but on a much more intense, immediate level. There was nowhere to hide, literally and figuratively. The early days were a blur of breathtaking landscapes and bewildering challenges. We fumbled with the chemical toilet, argued over the best way to pack the ludicrously small fridge, and discovered that offline maps are not always your friend. I remember one particular incident in Tuscany, which we now fondly refer to as the Great Tuscan Detour debacle. We were aiming for a quaint agriturismo, highly recommended, nestled deep in the rolling hills. Mark was driving, convinced his internal compass, honed by years of weekend sailing, was superior to my increasingly frantic pointing at the GPS, which was clearly having a meltdown. It says turn left here, Mark. The little arrow is definitely pointing left. I'd insisted, my voice rising a little. Sarah, my love, he'd replied, with that exaggerated patience that always signaled he thought I was being utterly irrational, there isn't a road to the left. There's a field. A field with very large cows. I think I'll trust my gut on this 1 inch. His gut, as it turned out, led us down a progressively narrowing track, past olive groves that scraped the wanderer's sides with angry fingernails, and towards what looked suspiciously like someone's private vineyard. The track eventually dwindled into nothing more than 2 grassy ruts. We were, to put it mildly, stuck. Not in mud, thankfully, but in a situation where reversing seemed impossible and going forward was clearly an invitation to trespass on a rather grand scale. The old us, the pre-Vanlife us, would have descended into a full-blown argument. Mark would have simmered in frustrated silence, convinced it was somehow my fault for distracting him with the GPS. I would have been a bundle of nerves, reciting a litany of "I told you so's" under my breath. There would have been blame, recrimination, and a long, icy drive once we eventually extricated ourselves. But this was different. We were in it together, quite literally. After the initial wave of exasperation, Mark let out a sigh that seemed to deflate the entire van, and I confess I might have muttered something about stubborn sailors. We just looked at each other. And then, a small laugh escaped me. It was so ridiculous. Here we were, supposedly living the dream, and we couldn't even find a farm. Mark caught my eye, and a reluctant smile tugged at his lips. "Okay," he said, "perhaps the cows had a point." That little moment broke the tension. We got out. We assessed. Mark, with his surprising spatial awareness, figured out a complex, inch-by-inch, 17-point turn that involved me getting out and guiding him with frantic hand signals, trying not to trample any precious Sangiovese grapes. It took nearly an hour. We were sweating, dusty, and the wanderer had acquired a few new pinstripes of Tuscan green. But as we finally bumped back onto a slightly more reputable dirt road, the feeling wasn't anger. It was a strange mix of relief and accomplishment. We'd navigated it, together. And then, as if fate wanted to reward our slightly improved marital harmony, just around the next bend was the tiniest, most unassuming trattoria, not even on our map. It had a chalkboard menu, 2 rickety tables outside, and an elderly nana who beamed at us. The pasta we ate there, under the shade of a gnarled olive tree, washed down with rough local wine, remains one of the best meals of our lives. "You know," I said, swirling the last of the wine in my glass, "if we hadn't gotten lost, we never would have found this place." Mark reached across the table and took my hand. "And I never would have learned that your Italian which way to a proper road, please, is surprisingly effective, especially when delivered with that panicked look." "Hey!" I protested, but I was laughing. We learned something crucial that day. We learned that sometimes, getting lost is part of the adventure. We learned that rigid plans are an invitation for frustration. And we began to truly see how our different strengths could complement each other. I might panic with a map, but I could usually charm my way into getting help or information. Mark might be occasionally overconfident in his navigation, but his calmness under pressure when it came to maneuvering our bulky home through tight spots was invaluable. We were starting to operate less like 2 individuals sharing a space, and more like a crew. That was a relatively minor hiccup, a story for a dinner party. But then came the Spanish Sierra engine failure, and that tested us on a whole different level. We were high in the Sierra Nevada mountains in Spain, miles from anything remotely resembling a town, on a road that was more goat track than thoroughfare. The wanderer had been making a slightly ominous coughing sound for a day or two, a sound Mark had optimistically diagnosed as, probably just some bad fuel. I remember the moment vividly. A particularly loud cough, a sickening lurch, and then, silence. An utter, complete, and terrifying silence from the engine. We coasted to a halt at the side of the narrow track, a sheer drop on one side, unyielding rock face on the other. The only sound was the wind whistling through the stunted pines and the frantic thumping of my own heart. "Okay," Mark said, his voice unnaturally calm. He tried the ignition. Nothing. Not even a click. He tried again. Silence. He let out a long breath and looked at me. "Well," he said, with a forced lightness, "this is suboptimal." Suboptimal was an understatement. We had no phone signal. The last village we'd passed was a good 2-hour hike back, assuming we even remembered the way. It was late afternoon, and the temperature was already dropping. This wasn't a charming detour, this was potentially dangerous. My first instinct was to panic. I could feel the familiar tightening in my chest, the urge to cry or shout or both. The old Sarah would have dissolved into a puddle of anxiety, probably making Mark even more stressed. But 5 years on the road, 5 years of relying on each other, had forged something new in me. I took a deep breath. "Right," I said, trying to emulate his calm. "What do we check first?" Mark, for his part, was already out, hood up, peering into the engine's depths with a frown that carved new lines into his forehead. I knew that frown. It was his "I am completely baffled but trying to look competent" frown. In the old days, his stress would manifest as a short temper, a clipped, impatient way of speaking. He'd snap if I asked what he thought was a stupid question. But now, though the tension was palpable in his shoulders, he just sighed. "I don't know, Sarah. It's not the battery, I don't think." It felt bigger than that. He poked at something with a screwdriver, then straightened up, wiping grease on his trousers. "I think this is beyond my roadside repair skills, which, as you know, are already fairly limited." This was a moment where we could have easily turned on each other. Blame could have been assigned, Mark for ignoring the coughing, me for, well, I'm sure he could have found something. But there was no energy for that, no space for it. The priority was stark: get safe, get help. The moment wasn't a sudden flash of mechanical insight. It was a quieter, deeper realization that washed over us almost simultaneously: we were completely, utterly reliant on each other. Every skill, every ounce of courage, every bit of linguistic fumbling we possessed, had to be pooled. "Okay," I said, my voice firmer now. "You stay with the van, see if you can at least make it visible if anyone does come. I'll start walking back towards that last village. I have water, a jacket, the emergency whistle." I tried to sound braver than I felt. The thought of walking alone on that remote track as dusk fell was genuinely frightening. Mark looked at me, his eyes filled with a concern that squeezed my heart. "Are you sure, Sarah? It's a long way." "I'm sure," I said. "My terrible Spanish is better than your non-existent Spanish if I do find someone. And you're better at waving people down with a look of desperate competence." He actually managed a weak smile at that. Desperate competence. "I'll take it." He rummaged in the back and found a high-visibility vest. "Put this on. And take the power bank for your phone, just in case you get a flicker of signal." So, I set off, the high-vis vest ridiculously bright against the muted greens and browns of the mountainside. Every step was a prayer. Mark, meanwhile, true to form, started tinkering again, not with any real hope of fixing the engine, but, as he told me later, to feel like I was doing something. He also methodically laid out our emergency triangle and even propped open the bonnet in what he hoped was a universally understood signal of "broken down vehicle, please pity us." Hours passed. For me, it was a grueling walk. The altitude made my lungs burn, and every shadow seemed to morph into something menacing. I practiced my Spanish phrases over and over: "Nuestro coche está roto. Necesitamos ayuda. Mecánico." My phone remained stubbornly signal-less. For Mark, it was an anxious vigil, punctuated by the occasional distant sound that would turn out to be nothing more than a goat. He told me later he replayed every decision that led us to that road, every cough the engine had made. He felt the weight of responsibility, not just for the van, but for me, out there alone. The turning point, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. Just as true darkness was beginning to settle, and I was contemplating the grim prospect of a night spent huddled by the roadside, I saw the faint glow of headlights far down the valley. Hope surged through me, so powerful it made my knees weak. I started waving my arms, blowing the whistle until my cheeks ached. The vehicle, an ancient Land Rover, eventually chugged its way up to me. Inside was a weathered farmer, his face a road map of wrinkles, and his equally weathered wife. My carefully rehearsed Spanish deserted me. I just pointed back up the road, babbling, "Furgoneta, kaput, mi esposo," and making engine-exploding noises. Amazingly, they understood. Or perhaps they just understood the universal language of a distressed woman in a fluorescent vest. With nods and kind smiles, they gestured for me to get in. The relief was so immense, I nearly wept. They drove me back to the Wanderer, where Mark's face, illuminated by their headlights, was a mask of anxiety that dissolved into pure, unadulterated relief when he saw me clambering out. The farmer, whose name was Miguel, peered at our engine with a practiced eye, tooted sympathetically, and then, after a brief, rapid-fire conversation with his wife Maria, conveyed through gestures and a few shared cognates, that he would tow us to the nearest village. Towing the Wanderer with that old Land Rover down those treacherous mountain bends in the dark was an adventure in itself, a slow, nerve-wracking crawl that had Mark gripping the steering wheel of our dead van as if his life depended on it, which, in a way, it did. We finally rolled into a tiny, sleeping village just before midnight. Miguel and Maria wouldn't hear of us sleeping in the van on the side of the road. They insisted we come to their small, rustic home. Maria produced a simple but delicious meal of bread, cheese, olives, and a hearty stew, while Miguel poured generous glasses of eye-wateringly strong local wine. They spoke no English, we spoke abysmal Spanish, but somehow, surrounded by their unassuming kindness, we felt safe and cared for. Later that night, tucked into a surprisingly comfortable bed in their spare room, the scent of wood smoke and old linen filling the air, Mark reached for my hand in the darkness. "We did it," he whispered, his voice thick with exhaustion and emotion. "You mean Miguel and Maria did it," I whispered back, squeezing his hand. "No," he said. "I mean we did it. You were so brave, Sarah, walking all that way. I was terrified for you." "And you," I said, tears pricking my eyes now that the adrenaline had finally worn off, "you didn't panic. You stayed calm, you thought about safety. You even managed not to blame me for picking this ridiculous route." He chuckled softly. "It was a team effort, this particular disaster. And 10, 15 years ago, this would have ended in a spectacular row. Days of silent treatment, probably. Or worse, me trying to fix it myself out of sheer stubbornness and making it 10 times worse." I knew he was right. Back in our old life, a crisis like this would have exposed all the hairline cracks in our communication. Stress brought out our individual defenses, Mark's stoic withdrawal or impatient command, my anxious overtalking or tearful retreat. But here, in this remote Spanish mountain village, after a day that had pushed us to our limits, there was no blame, no resentment. Just a profound sense of shared experience, of having faced something scary and come through it, not unscathed, but together. The van wasn't fixed, but something in our relationship felt stronger, more resilient than ever. That night, the peak wasn't reaching a stunning viewpoint or celebrating a successful repair, it was the quiet acknowledgement of our mutual reliance, our rediscovered strengths, and the deep, unspoken love that had guided us through the darkness. The kindness of strangers had been the catalyst, but our response, our teamwork, was the real victory. The next morning, Miguel, true to his word, summoned the village's only mechanic, a wiry old man named Raphael who seemed to understand engines through a combination of intuition and long experience. It took most of the day, a lot of expressive shrugging, and the consumption of many small, strong coffees, but by late afternoon, the Wanderer was purring again. A faulty fuel injector, apparently. Raphael gave Mark a stern lecture in Spanish, which Mark nodded at with great seriousness, understanding perhaps one word in 10 but getting the general gist that he should probably pay more attention to ominous coughing sounds. As we drove away from that little village, waving goodbye to Miguel, Maria, and Raphael, who all stood by the roadside to see us off like family, there was a sense of quiet triumph. It wasn't just about the van being fixed. It was about us. We'd faced a significant challenge, one that could have easily derailed a less seasoned or more fractious couple, and we'd navigated it with a degree of grace and teamwork that honestly surprised us both. "I said, as we found a peaceful spot to park for the night by a reservoir, the setting sun turning the water to molten gold. I think we're getting good at this. Mark smiled, draping an arm around my shoulders. Good at breaking down in remote locations, you mean? No, silly, I laughed, leaning into him. Good at being a team. Good at, us. In this crazy life. We sat there for a long time, watching the stars begin to prick the darkening sky, the silence comfortable, companionable. The fear and anxiety of the previous day had been replaced by a quiet contentment, a deeper appreciation for the simple fact of being together, safe, with our home once again under our own power. These kinds of challenges, big and small, became the unlikely bedrock of our strengthened relationship. It's a paradox, isn't it? You'd think constant proximity and shared stress would wear you down, would magnify every little irritation. And in the very beginning, sometimes it did. I remember snappy exchanges over whose turn it was to empty the toilet cassette, or Mark getting exasperated with my inability to fold a map correctly, an art form I still haven't mastered, by the way. But the difference was, in The Wanderer, there was no storming off to separate rooms. There was no escaping into the buffer of work or friends for an evening. Issues, even minor ones, had to be addressed, talked through, resolved. Otherwise, the 70 square feet of our home felt impossibly small, thick with unspoken tension. We learned to communicate more directly, more honestly, and, crucially, more kindly. We learned to listen, truly listen, not just wait for our turn to speak or to be right. And humor. My goodness, humor became our superpower. We learned to laugh at ourselves, at our mistakes, at the sheer absurdity of some of the situations we found ourselves in. Like the time I ambitiously decided to bake a soufflé on our single gas burner in the middle of a Galician forest. The result was less light and airy French delicacy, and more sad, rubbery pancake with aspirations. Mark took one look at it, then at my crestfallen face, and burst out laughing. Not unkindly, but with a genuine amusement that was so infectious, I had to join in. We ate instant noodles for dinner that night, still chuckling. At least it didn't set off the smoke alarm this time, he'd quipped, referencing another culinary misadventure involving an overenthusiastic searing of sausages. Even the mundane chores of van life became shared endeavors that fostered connection. Planning our routes together, poring over maps and guidebooks, yes, actual paper ones sometimes, became a nightly ritual, full of anticipation and shared dreams. Grocery shopping in foreign supermarkets was an adventure in deciphering labels and discovering new foods. Laundry day, often involving a quest for a launderette and a stockpile of small change, became an opportunity for people-watching and quiet conversation. Even cleaning The Wanderer, a never-ending battle against dust and clutter in such a confined space, was something we tackled as a team, developing an efficient, if sometimes grudging, system. It was our shared home, our shared responsibility, our shared adventure. Every little task, every decision, from where to park for the night to what to have for dinner, was a micro-negotiation, a micro-collaboration. This constant, enforced teamwork, this shared ownership of our daily lives, began to strip away the layers of assumption and routine that had built up over years in our old, more compartmentalized existence. In our house, we had our separate domains, our separate responsibilities. Mark handled the finances and the garden, I managed the social calendar and the interior decorating. We operated efficiently, but often independently. In The Wanderer, every aspect of life was intertwined. It's fascinating, really, how van life deconstructs the personas you might have unconsciously adopted in a more conventional life. Back home, Mark was Mark the project manager, calm, analytical, always in control. I was Sarah the librarian, organized, quiet, perhaps a little too fond of routine. Those identities served us well in our careers, but they also created a kind of formal distance between us at times. On the road, those labels faded. We weren't defined by our jobs or our social roles anymore. We were just Mark and Sarah, partners in exploration, co-captains of a very small, slightly battered ship. This stripping away allowed us to see each other more clearly, perhaps as we hadn't since those very early days of our relationship, before careers and mortgages and the comfortable complexities of adult life had set in. I rediscovered Mark's playful, adventurous spirit, the one that had first drawn me to him, a spirit that had been somewhat submerged under the weight of corporate responsibility. He, in turn, saw a resilience and adaptability in me that perhaps even I hadn't fully recognized. "I never knew you were so good at haggling," he'd said with genuine admiration after I'd successfully negotiated a better price for a beautiful Berber rug in a Moroccan souk, armed with nothing but a phrasebook and a determined smile. "And I never knew you could fix a leaking water pump with nothing but a paperclip and sheer willpower," I'd countered, remembering a particularly damp crisis in the wilds of Scotland. These rediscoveries weren't always dramatic. Often, they were quiet moments of appreciation. Watching Mark patiently help a fellow camper troubleshoot an electrical issue, his explanations clear and kind. Or me, managing to navigate us through the chaotic streets of Naples using a combination of Google Maps and wild gesticulation, emerging triumphant and only slightly traumatized. We saw each other rise to occasions, adapt to unforeseen circumstances, and connect with strangers with an openness that our old, more insulated life rarely demanded. The joy of shared discovery is another profound relationship builder. It's not just the big, iconic sights, though seeing the northern lights dance over a Norwegian fjord together, or watching the sunrise illuminate the temples of Angkor Wat, are memories etched into our souls. It's the small things, too. That hidden cove in Croatia, accessible only by a rough track, where we swam in crystal-clear water with no one else around. The tiny, family-run bakery in a French village that sold the most exquisite almond croissants we've ever tasted. The elderly Portuguese fisherman who shared his freshly caught sardines with us, cooked over an open fire on the beach, his stories as rich and flavorful as the food. These experiences, big and small, create a unique, shared tapestry. They are our stories, our memories, woven together thread by thread, mile by mile. They belong to no one else. And when you build a life based on collecting moments rather than things, the value of the person you're sharing those moments with becomes immeasurable. You become each other's primary witness, the keeper of shared secrets and sacred memories. Patience. If Vanlife teaches you anything, it's patience. Patience with traffic, with bureaucracy when crossing borders, with the van when it decides to have a moment, and, most importantly, patience with each other. When you're tired, hungry, and have just taken a wrong turn for the third time in an hour, it's easy to snap. We still do, occasionally. We're human. But we've learned to recognize the warning signs, to take a breath, to give each other a little more grace. We've learned that a minor irritation doesn't need to escalate into a major conflict, especially when your entire world is contained within a few square meters. I think, Mark mused one evening, as we sat by a crackling campfire in the Australian outback, the vast, star-dusted sky stretching endlessly above us, the biggest change is that we don't sweat the small stuff anymore. Or at least, we sweat it a lot less. And we've learned what the actual small stuff is, I added. A flat tire is an inconvenience. Forgetting to buy milk is trivial. A harsh word spoken in a moment of stress, that needs addressing. But the view from that mountain pass we nearly didn't make it up. That's what matters. The kindness of that family who shared their dinner with us when we were lost. That's what we remember. Gratitude has become a daily practice, almost without conscious effort. Gratitude for a sunny day after a week of rain. Gratitude for a hot shower. Gratitude for a safe place to park for the night. And an overwhelming gratitude for each other, for the fact that we embarked on this mad, wonderful adventure together, and that it has, against all initial anxieties, brought us closer than we ever imagined possible. Our disagreements, when they happen, are different now. There's less ego involved, less need to win the argument. When your partner is also your navigator, your co-chef, your mechanic's assistant, your sole source of companionship for days on end, and the person whose face you see last at night and first in the morning, you quickly learn that winning an argument is a hollow victory if it damages the harmony of your tiny, rolling world. The focus shifts to understanding, to finding a solution, to moving forward together. Because the journey is shared, and the destination, ultimately, is continued companionship. We've learned to say, "I'm sorry," more quickly, and to mean it. We've learned to forgive more easily. These aren't just relationship platitudes, they're essential survival skills for long-term van life as a couple. We're still learning, of course. Every new country, every new challenge, teaches us something more about the world, about ourselves, and about our partnership. There are days when the proximity feels a bit much, when we both crave a little solitude, and we've learned to recognize and respect that need in each other. Mark will go for a long hike, or I'll find a quiet cafe to read in for a few hours. That ability to give each other space, even within the confines of this lifestyle, is another lesson hard-won and deeply valued. The road ahead will undoubtedly hold more breakdowns, more detours, more moments of, "What on earth were we thinking?" But we face it with a quiet confidence, not just in the wanderer's ability to keep rolling, but in our ability to navigate whatever comes our way, together. Our relationship isn't just surviving van life, it's actively thriving because of it. It's been tempered in the fires of shared challenges and polished by the beauty of shared discoveries. Van life didn't magically fix our relationship. There was no pre-existing major damage to fix, thankfully, just the slow, almost imperceptible erosion that routine and unexamined lives can cause. What van life did was provide the environment, the constant, gentle pressure, and the undeniable impetus for us to do the work. It forced us to confront our patterns, to communicate more deeply, to appreciate each other more fully, and to actively build something even stronger on the solid foundation we already had. It taught us to be better partners, not by reading books or attending workshops, but by living, breathing, and problem-solving together, day in and day out. Mark puts down his empty coffee cup now, here in our Pyrenean paradise, and walks over to where I'm standing by the van's open door. He slips an arm around my waist, and we look out at that breathtaking valley, the mist almost entirely burned off, revealing a tapestry of greens and browns under the brilliant morning sun. "So, when people ask," he says, his voice soft, "if it's hard, living like this, what's the short answer we give them now?" I lean my head on his shoulder, a familiar, comforting weight. The short answer. I smile. It's that we traded a big house with separate rooms for a tiny home with a massive, shared view. And in doing so, we found our way back to the best view of all, each other. He kisses the top of my head. Couldn't have said it better myself. Now, how about we see what adventures, and maybe just a few minor disagreements about map reading, today has in store for us. And that's the essence of it, really. This life, this choice we made after 50, hasn't just been about seeing the world. It's been about seeing each other with fresh eyes, with renewed appreciation, with a love that's been road-tested and proven to be more resilient, more adventurous, and more deeply joyful than we ever dreamed possible. It's about continuing to write our story, 1 mile, 1 shared smile, 1 heartfelt conversation at a time. And we wouldn't trade it for anything.